continues in in response to our carbon emissions. Next slide, please. But regardless of the threats that climate change brings, today we really want to focus on the opportunity that we have to improve our relationship with nature and enhance the lives of Boston residents in these two neighborhoods. So while this project is focused specifically on coastal solutions for East Boston and Charlestown, building a resilient Boston includes a broader strategy that considers buildings and transportation, regulations, job creation, and other efforts to ensure that we can all thrive regardless of our changing climate. Next slide, please. So this may be familiar to many of you, but again, I'm going to share a bit of background about the work to those who may be newer to the conversation. And sorry, I was just asked by our interpreter to slow down a little bit, so I will slow down. So the work we're here to discuss today builds on a long history of efforts to prepare Boston for the impacts of climate change. The city published the original Climate Ready Boston report back in 2016, which included a citywide vulnerability assessment and a strategy to address climate change, which laid the groundwork for the work that we are doing today. Since then, the city has been developing neighborhood level plans in the 5 neighborhoods that are the most at risk of sea level rise, and offering recommendations for how to protect these neighborhoods, their residents, and the city more broadly from flooding. In 2017, we concluded the first phase of the East Boston and Charlestown Climate Ready Boston report. Between 2018 and 2020, we released Climate Ready Boston reports for South Boston, downtown and North End, and Dorchester. And so today we're working on the second phase of Climate Ready East Boston and Charlestown, which is looking at areas that were not covered in the 2017 study. Next slide, please. So numerous projects based on the recommendations from these neighborhood level reports have since been completed or are in progress. In the upper left-hand corner is an image of Langone Park and Popolo Playground, which is a resilient waterfront park that was completed last year in the North End. And in the bottom image, you'll see that in 2018, the city installed a deployable floodgate on the East Boston Greenway to address an immediate flood pathway into the neighborhood. And then currently underway are several projects to redesign Moakley Park in Dorchester and Ryan's Playground in Charlestown into resilient waterfront parks that will act as flood protection, but will also add new amenities to these neighborhoods. And these are just a few examples of the types of projects that have resulted from past studies. Next slide, please. So much of the Climate Ready Boston work has been focused on coastal resilience, but we're also working on a citywide heat resilience study to assess today's heat risk, develop strategies for adapting to rising temperatures, and reduce the impact of extreme heat on our communities as we experience it today. And my colleague, Zoe Davis, is the project manager for that project. And Zoe, if you could drop your email in the chat in case people have questions, you can reach out to Zoe if you have any questions about the work on the heat study. And now I'm going to turn it over to Trevor.
Thanks, Kat. That was a great foundation for our project. So hi, everybody. My name is Trevor Johnson. I'm a project manager for Coastal Resilience Solutions for East Boston and Charlestown Phase 2, working closely with the city and our project team on this planning process, and happy to see all of you here tonight. I'm going to quickly walk through our study area and some of our project schedule, and then we'll talk a little bit about the flood risk facing both East Boston and Charlestown, as well as our process of developing coastal resilience solutions as a foundation for the conversation that we'll be having about conceptual designs and plans in the breakout. So we very much encourage all of you to stay around and join us for those interactive breakout sessions. I'm going to try to speak slowly for the benefit of our interpreters as well, which is more of a reminder to myself than anyone else. So this map shows our study areas in East Boston and Charlestown in the dark red dashed lines. We're focused, as Catherine mentioned, on the areas of both neighborhoods that weren't studied in 2017 during the phase 1 planning process. So in East Boston, this study area includes the waterfront along Chelsea Creek to the Revere border, the Suffolk Downs site, Belle Isle Marsh, and then around to Constitution Beach. In Charlestown, we're focused on the neighborhood facing the harbor facing area of the neighborhood, including the Navy Yard area, Little Mystic Channel, and the Mystic River waterfront. Now we'll talk a little bit more about these areas in depth later tonight during our breakouts. Our work on these studies is coordinated with many community partners and involves work across, in partnership with many city, state, and nonprofit groups, agencies, and departments. We're working on and helping to inform the work of 2 parallel planning efforts that are being led by the city, including the Plan East Boston and Plan Charlestown processes. And these processes look at neighborhood-wide land uses and infrastructure needs. And members of the planning team from the Boston Planning and Development Agency are here with us tonight, and we'll be participating in the breakout discussions to help answer any questions about these plans and the relationship between the coastal resilience planning process and those larger neighborhood-wide planning processes. Now a bit about our process. So welcome back to those of you who joined us for our first open house or who have participated in this project through other means or other opportunities. For you, this slide might be a reminder, but for those who are joining us for the first time, welcome. We've been working on this project since September of last year, and it's really divided across 2 primary phases with community engagement really running throughout. So at the same time, the first phase of our work involved a lot of learning and analysis, which included looking at existing conditions, examining flood risk in both neighborhoods, and really learning as much as we can about the communities. At the same time, we started to think about potential options for addressing flood risk through preliminary technical analyses. The next phase of the project has built on everything that we've learned through the first phase, and we've begun to create solutions for building long-term coastal resilience and managing and reducing coastal flood risk. This stage began this spring and will continue through the summer and into the process of developing our final report early this fall. And community input has been and will continue to be really critical, not just for the duration of this process, but in all the steps that will come after this planning process as we work towards implementation of coastal resilience solutions in both neighborhoods. We'll talk a little bit more about what that process looks like in just a minute. So before going through the process of arriving at coastal resilience solutions and concepts, let's talk a little bit about the flood risk facing East Boston and Charlestown. And just a reminder for those who have joined us after the start of the open house here tonight, interpretation is available by clicking on the globe here at the base of the screen. So we'll talk about specific impacts of coastal flood risk in just a moment, but some of you may have, this may be a refresher for some folks who have seen slides, this slide or a slide like it before, but for those who are joining us for the first time, we're really looking at 3 different types of hazards when we're talking about coastal flood risk. The first is tidal flooding, and tidal flooding is flooding that happens when a shoreline is overtopped at high tide. As many know, this happens already in Boston during what are often called king tides, when low-lying areas of the city are overtopped once or twice a year. And tidal flooding can happen frequently and is considered a nuisance at first, but over time becomes more and more frequent and more disruptive. The second hazard type is storm surge. Storm surge is caused by winds and the pressures that storms create as they approach land. and is associated with water levels that rise far above normal time levels and cause flooding on land. In Boston, storm surge is most often caused by hurricanes and by nor'easters, as many may remember from 2018 when several nor'easters caused flooding across the city. The big difference between storm surge and tidal flooding is that storm surge only tends to happen once in a while, whereas tidal flooding can happen every single day. And then the third type of hazard that we look at is winds and erosion, or excuse me, waves and erosion. In Charlestown and East Boston, and in fact in most of Boston's harbor, these issues are not as pronounced because it is a sheltered harbor. But with a large storm, the wind associated with a large storm can cause waves and lead to erosion in unprotected shorelines. So it's something that we do have to pay attention to. And all three of these hazards exist across Boston today, but are actually projected to increase and will be exacerbated by future sea level rise. So it's important that we understand what the impacts today will be, as well as how those impacts are going to increase over time. And so on that note, we wanted to talk a little bit about, how, what this risk actually means for the neighborhoods. We'll look at flood maps and the breakout so you understand the extent of what flooding might look like now in the future. But really the question for us is, what does this mean for the people who live and work and experience both Charlestown and East Boston? And as I mentioned, coastal flood risks do have impacts or have the potential to impact the community today. So today, approximately 2,500 residents are at risk due to coastal flooding from a major hurricane or large storm. With 9 inches of sea level rise, which is expected around 2030, we could see that number increase to just over 3,000 residents. And with 40 inches of sea level rise, which is what the city of Boston is planning for, expected around or before 2070, we could see as many as 4,600 residents impacted by a large coastal storm event. And that's without any population change. So it's looking at today's population figures. And it's not just impacts on people's homes and the people themselves, but also on the services that the community relies on for quality of life. So we could see under today's flood conditions, up to 500 riders who use the Charlestown Longworth Ferry experiencing disruptions of that service that they depend on to get to work and around the city. We could also see with 40 inches of sea level rise impacts to important community assets like New Health Charlestown, hindering access to affordable high quality healthcare. And then finally, with 40 inches of sea level rise, we could see up to 60% of the income restricted housing units in Charlestown exposed to flooding in a major storm. So clearly this is very important. It's something that we need to be thinking about and beginning to plan for today. And a similar story exists in East Boston. And in fact, in the long term, even more residents are at risk. So today, approximately 2,000 residents of East Boston are at risk due to flooding from a major storm or hurricane. With 9 inches of sea level rise, that number increases to 2,500. And with 40 inches of sea level rise, we could see that number increase up to 5,000 residents. Again, not accounting for any population change. And this will similarly have impacts on the services and infrastructure that the community depends on. So with flooding today and into the future, we could see up to 4,800 daily trips on the MBTA Blue Line at the Orient Heights and Suffolk Downs T stations disrupted. And of course, impacts across the system could lead to disrupted service system-wide. Similarly, we could see impacts to the newly renovated Marty Pino Center, which obviously is a resource and community asset for the community, providing after-school care, adult education, recreation, fitness programs, and other opportunities for the East Boston community. And then finally, with 40 inches of sea level rise, we could see over half of the income restricted units across East Boston exposed to flooding during a major storm event. So as you can see, both neighborhoods are at risk of coastal flooding. We'll talk more about the specifics on this a little bit later in the breakouts, but it's really important that we're here today to talk about the opportunities that we have to reduce and manage these risks over time so that we don't see these impacts, these disruptions to quality of life in East Boston and Charlestown. I'm going to turn it over now to my colleague, Wendell Joseph from Sasaki, who's just going to quickly speak to some of the messages that we've been hearing as we've spoken with community members over the past 6 to 9 months.
Thank you, Trevor, and good evening, everyone. So just a quick couple minutes talking about community engagement. As Trevor mentioned, we've been looking to engage with you all in Charlestown and East Boston in the course of this project. As you know, unfortunately, COVID threw a wrench in our plans, and so we had to pivot and try to be a little bit more creative and flexible in how we engage with you all, given how different things are. And so earlier on, we've deployed a number of different strategies. We had an interactive survey, a mapping survey that I'm sure some of you participated in. We set up QR codes in different locations around East Boston and Charlestown. And we had a couple of surveys as well to try to really open up the opportunities for folks to know what's going on in this project and be involved as well. And so it's important for us to kind of like talk about this, and because when we talk about the preliminary design solutions in a bit, it's important to note that we were able to arrive at these solutions in no small part from the engagement and feedback that we received from the community so far. The next slide captures some of the main themes that have come up throughout these different strategies over the last 6 to 9 months. As you can see, they range from the importance of housing in all of this to infrastructure, right? Streets, roads, the T. I'd say probably the biggest theme has been the importance of preserving the open spaces and natural spaces in both East Boston and Charlestown. So we do want to look for solutions that will protect the neighborhoods, but not necessarily in a way that precludes the use of these natural and open spaces for recreational use by the community, whether it's, you know, children's sports, families, whatever the case may be. So that's really been something that we've tried to be intentional about in the design solutions. The last thing I'll say before I pass it on to Kate is that, you know, throughout all of this, it's not to say that the comments that we've received are representative of the community in its entirety. There's still ongoing conversations that need to be had. We're certainly grateful for what we've learned so far and how it's been able to help us come up with these solutions. The conversation is certainly going to continue. So we look forward to the feedback you'll give us today, and, you know, future conversations moving forward. And Kate, I'll pass it off to you.
Thanks, Wendell. If we can go to the next slide, great. So we're going to talk a little bit about how we develop coastal resilience solutions with community engagement in mind and the flood risk we're facing. So next slide. And another reminder for those of you who have just joined us that we have interpretation services available tonight. If you just go down to the bottom of your screen and click on the globe there, you'll be able to access our interpretation channels. Okay, so when we think of coastal resilience solutions and the infrastructure we're thinking about putting in place in these areas, we're really talking about 3 components: alignment, approach, and design. Alignment is, where is the infrastructure or solution going to be located in space? Is it going to be along the waterfront? Is it going to be in a public right-of-way? Things like that. Approach is, what is it? Will it be a flood wall, a berm, a raised harbor walk? And design gets into more of what it looks like. So how can we make it a beneficial part of the community and provide other benefits to community members? Next slide. Okay, so how we compare options is across evaluation criteria. There are many ways that we can protect the community from coastal flooding impacts, but not all of them will work everywhere. And not all of them provides the same opportunities for the community. Nearly every solution involves a series of trade-offs. The evaluation criteria are used to compare options and prioritize the things that matter most in different locations. So for example, in areas where we have heard a preference for new amenities or opportunities for recreation, in addition to knowing that the flood protection needs to be effective, we look for opportunities to improve or add public access and other types of activities and work those into the infrastructure solution that will be put in place there. We also evaluate options across other technical criteria, like when can the resilience be built, and can it be built today or in the future, and does it meaningfully reduce risk in the neighborhood? Next slide. All right, so alignment. Again, this is where is the infrastructure or solution going to be located? And we look at things like, where is the flood protection needed to close off a flood pathway? Does the alignment protect community lifelines like evacuation routes? Can the flood protection be constructed in that location? Are there things in the way? Who owns the property? Who do we have to work with to potentially implement it? And what opportunities for benefits to the community are possible in that location? And when we look at approach, we're thinking about the types of resilience approaches that are possible in that location. So things like what's the available space, existing infrastructure, what did the community say about what they'd like to see in the area, and regulations on what can be built in the area now and in the future. So it's important to recognize that not every approach is possible in every location for a number of reasons. Community interest in new access to the water might mean that we look at approaches that add new walkways and access points in combination with the flood protection. And for design, we really explore the potential design to the solutions through this plan, and the design will be refined over time beyond the planning process. But talking about design now really helps us understand how the resilient solution can be most beneficial to the community. So looking at opportunities for recreation, habitat restoration, and access to the water. And the last slide I have here is just talking a little bit about next steps, because we'll continue to refine our ideas before we produce the plan and put it out. But the projects will begin after that day, a process of further planning and testing feasibility and then implementation. So that process can take many years, but that's why we start now. These projects have to go through design and engineering, permitting, building whatever we design, and operating and maintaining those, and then looking at them and changing conditions and adapting for the future. And I think I'm going to pass it back to Trevor at this point.
Sorry about that. Was struggling to get off mute, but yes, that is correct. So now we're going to transition to breakout rooms. So we'll have 2 breakout rooms, and we'll have one for East Boston and one for Charlestown. So if you're interested in East Boston and discussing solutions in East Boston, you'll go to that breakout. If you're interested in discussing solutions for Charlestown, you'll go to that breakout. And what we'll cover in each of them will be the flood risk, further information on the flood risk, as well as coastal resilience strategies, and then the preliminary designs for several focus areas in both neighborhoods. And we'll talk more about the agenda within the focus groups or breakouts. But we're really interested in questions that you may have about our process and preliminary ideas, additional ideas that you have, and then amenities and activities that you'd like to see as part of the solutions. So I'm going to open the breakout in a moment. For those of you who are interested in discussing East Boston, you don't need to do anything. Just stay where you are. You will stay in this main breakout Simultaneous interpretation to Spanish will be available in East Boston. So just hang tight while we get organized. For Charlestown, I'm going to open up the Charlestown breakout group in just a moment. You should be able to self-select into the Charlestown breakout, but if you're not able to, just go ahead and put in the chat that you'd like to enter Charlestown, and we will make sure to get you there in the next couple minutes as we get organized. So I'm going to open now, and hopefully it all goes seamlessly, but be patient just as we get ourselves organized here.